Hey, Jake, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Oh, thank you guys very much for having me.
Yeah, we're excited to chat with you, learn more about your story and founding of Maui Nui. But before we jump in, what's top of mind for you right now, Jake?
Top of mind, we just spent a couple of weeks finishing up a grant proposal for NASA and got connected with some amazing people at Harvard, ASU, and MIT, people that we might have never thought to be connected to. But the grant looks at utilizing the NASA satellite that passes over Hawaii every day at about 10 o'clock. And the folks at MIT, ASU, and Harvard believe they can actually detect deer with that satellite and then use machine learning from the data, the ground data we provide every night, and the relative data from the satellite to do route planning. So our deer are truly wild to the second harvest. We start every night not knowing. We do use some pretty advanced like FLIR drone systems, but we just went through this 2 week process with them to like better understand how that technology works, was blown away. And they're fairly confident that they can predict and tell us where to go, which would just be extraordinary, right?
That's incredible. Yeah, I mean that would be a fundamental change to how you do harvesting.
Yeah, and I think the technology also can be extrapolated to how Fish and Wildlife Service looks at animal densities for hunting purposes. Like it's a different way to collect data on wild animal densities, which is applicable like everywhere. Fingers crossed, but it'll be really interesting to see if we can put that together.
That's super exciting. Jake, want to get into the story of Maui Nui, your story. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and what ultimately got you involved in food and agriculture.
I think what we do is considered ag, but long story short, grew up as a subsistence hunter and within a subsistence hunting family in northern Canada. Was lucky enough to come out to the University of Hawaii to do some NCAA sports out here. Was introduced to a family on a very small island called Molokai and introduced to axis deer, which I had never guessed there would be animals at this scale out here on the Hawaiian Islands. I think a lot of people don't know that. And again, skipping forward very quickly, after a 5 or 6 year recreational relationship with this animal, saw one of their first die-offs. So axis deer on the islands have no predators, essentially unlimited feed, grow to a max capacity, and the only thing currently balancing their populations is they basically reset themselves via starvation, which is terrible, right? Fell in love with this animal, fed me through college as the starving college kid, which I'm sure you two can relate. And then saw this pronounced die off, came to the island to go hunting and saw hundreds of animals basically laying down, dying of malnutrition. And I think it's that like key moment for a lot of different entrepreneurs. There's got to be a better way. Like it's that classic, like there has to be a better way to manage or to have a management strategy outside of every 10 or 15 years that too many of them, they die of starvation. And started the very long process then of better understanding the animal, or working through years and years of population dynamics, started a nonprofit called the Axis Deer Institute because nobody in India would answer any of my emails. So I just made myself the executive director, nice logo. And all of a sudden they were like, yes, we're happy to give you whatever information you want. And then, summarizing a very long story, 4 axis deer were illegally introduced to the Big Island. There previously wasn't any. This was about 12 years ago. And the Axis Deer Institute happened to be the only people that knew anything about them. We were given the contract to find and remove those 4 deer, and they didn't know where they were. They were in a 100,000 square acre area. And it ended up being a literal 3 year hunt. Like we hunted every single day except Sundays. It took us 9 months to find the first ones, and then another like essentially 2.5 years to get the rest of them. And during that period of time, we developed highly advanced, like forward looking infrared survey methodologies that weren't being used anywhere else to try and increase detection rates via helicopter. So we actually found, removed all of those animals, certified the entire area that they weren't there. And then people started saying, wait a second, if you can do that, why don't we talk about addressing the 60,000 deer that are on Maui? And that then spurred the conversation of there has to be a better way than just shooting these animals and not eating them. And that was the first phone call to the USDA to say, hey, we know nobody's ever done this before, but we'd like to take your anti-mortem rules, which is their rules for rendering, and move them into the field. And there had been some framework with like bison and elk and in some different places farmed, but never essentially in the wild. So skip forward 7 years after that, we're now in the place where we're essentially at full capacity. We'll probably do up to 15 to 20,000 deer this year, and also process 1 million pounds as well. We built out a full facility to do all of that. Long story short, but an irrational obsession that started as just like a love for an animal, didn't really see it as an invasive species, didn't start within that like negative connotation, and just a constant, oh, there's got to be a better way to do this thing, which I'm sure is the way you guys look at the farm every day, I'm sure.
Love the backstory. I have so many questions, so many places we could go with this, but would love to start with that initial problem that you outlaid of the overpopulation and inability to hunt. What were some of the first steps you took to approach the USDA of kind of this different business model of how you could potentially deal with the challenge the island was facing with the overpopulation?
Yeah, great question. The federal government is a very large boat to try and move. And in this particular instance, like they didn't budge. So what we had to show them is that we could meet all of the requirements within a brick and mortar that they would typically go through, i.e., like they can view the animal before rendering, before it's killed, like they can view that it's healthy, they can look at it, it's handled humanely, and then we basically had to meet every single one of those rules. So we had to develop systems in the wild that allowed them to do those exact same things or better, including the rendering rate. And rendering, just being a name for that animal, has to be within a facility shot in the head, it has to die instantly. And we had to develop systems in the field that met that same standard of 99.9%. Like, you are not allowed within the framework of the USDA FSAS to make mistakes. They shut you down, which is why they're there. They're there to make sure that those animals are handled humanely and they're safe to eat. So we had to show them. You can imagine the first phone call that said, we think we can do all of these things with a combination of forward-looking infrared and these different processes. And they were like, no. Like, that's, so we finally got somebody to come out and view the process. And he was like, oh, wait, can you do this every single time? And we're like, yes. And then it triggered the, okay, but you need to be getting the animal to your slaughter facility within 45 minutes. Then they placed all of the other rules on it. And that triggered the amazing call to my wife and co-founder that said, let's remortgage the house to buy a mobile slaughter facility. And she was like, oh boy, you better know what you're doing. So to answer your question, it was, they didn't make any exceptions for us. It was, how do you follow all of the rules within the Federal Meat Inspection Act, but do so in the field? And there was some framework within some of the anti-mortem language that was already there, some of the language that was already in place for bison, elk, and some of the other like harvesting that was going on. But we had to take it a step further. We do everything at night and basically show them that we can meet all those same rules and regulations, which we've been able to do consistently over the last 7 years.
That's literally crazy. I can see why your wife was like, "Excuse me." What a crazy story. So, walk us through. You have to get through these like regulatory hurdles to ensure that you're not going to get shut down. Talk us through those early days of figuring how to like scale this into a business.
Oh man. One of the biggest hurdles is, so we fall into a category within the USDA called voluntary inspection, not mandatory. So mandatory inspection is beef, pork, chicken. You say you're going to be slaughtering animals and it's a USDA facility, they have to show up. That service is paid for by us, the taxpayers, right? So voluntary inspection is very much the word voluntary. We ask them to be there. They don't necessarily have to show up. And we have to pay them $90 to $100 an hour to be there. So there's like substantial overhead for voluntary inspection. And being a far corner of one of the USDA circuits that is hard to staff, the biggest hurdles in the beginning were just enough USDA staffing. So give you a picture of what it used to look like. We have to have both a USDA inspector with us the whole time, and then a USDA veterinarian, which typically only visits a plant once or twice a year, has to be with us the entire time. Actually, they come in the morning to basically do what is called postmortem and recheck every single animal. So we're paying for 2 people to be there the whole time. And typically, your veterinarian is your frontline supervisor. They're the person that runs the circuit. So the frontline supervisor was on Oahu, which is on a different island. So the inspector would come out with us from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., shoot as many animals as we could within regulation. We would then, the only flight into Maui was 12. So me and my whole team would sleep either under the mobile slaughter facility or like in a truck or something, wait for them to show up at 12. And we'd already been up since 11 at night and get the postmortem inspection done. They'd leave, they'd put a stamp on it. And then the entire time it was, we didn't know if they were going to show up 3 times a month or 12 times a month. So we had no consistency. So you were dealing with both the variability of a wild animal, like shooting 7 a night or shooting 27, and dealing the variability of the USDA. So scaling early on was extremely difficult. It was basically a month to month thing. And then the true unlock was, I don't know if they decided we just weren't going away or whatever the thing was. They finally moved the frontline supervisor to Maui, which was the unlock of you can have an inspection every day if you want. And we've still had to add capacity from there. But that took 5 years. That was 5 years of every month saying, is this going to work this month? What are we like? How are we going to make this work? So it was tough, but like any classic entrepreneurial story, I think you go back and say, well, if you would have known, would you have done that? And I think it's still a yes. And it's just because it's an irrational obsession. But yeah, it took a long time to scale. And now we're at the point where basically demand is the only cap at this point, and finding sustainability for communities and ecology and what that looks like moving forward.
Jake, really want to dig in and learn about building the brand and going direct to consumer. But before we jump in, just wanted to close the loop on just how you manage this at scale in the wild. There's a lot of models for meat where you're looking at fenced properties to keep the animals contained. You're hunting out in the wild. How do you manage the population and make sure that you're not overhunting, underhunting, and managing the animal
Yeah, great
population?
question. So that 3 year hunt where we had to develop the most advanced survey technology for mammals to within, I can get up in the morning, jump in the helicopter, cover 14,000 acres in an hour and a half, and tell you to 99% the exact number of deer there. If we couldn't collect data, I would never do this. I would think it would be irresponsible to community. So we can collect highly accurate data on what not only our management doing is but what's happening in the collective areas. Like in an aggregate, we're only allowed to do this type of harvesting on private land. We're not allowed to do it on public land. So we're constantly balancing what that looks like. And basically, in the end, the decision is ours. We go to a large landowner and say, you've got 9,000 deer on the property. How many do you want? What do you think is a good match for cattle and whatever else is happening? And they say, let's get it down to 4,000 and see what that looks like. And we're able to execute on that.
Want to jump into the brand and kind of going direct to consumer. Talk to us a little bit about your approach there. I think your business is really fascinating because you have this infinitely complex production side, but then you've done a really good job of telling your story and communicating what makes your product unique. So tell us about that side of the house and how you guys have thought about that.
Yeah, I think we got really lucky. Like we said, big fans of your guys' podcast and the constant conversation of what is regenerative ag and how do we define it. Oh, that is so confusing. Like it's so confusing for any brand trying to get there. And like I'm not quite there yet. Like I constantly hear this story. Our story is super simple. We have the only stress-free red meat on the market. Like this animal's wild to the moment harvested. If they don't die immediately, they run away. Like they are truly wild, truly stress free. We now know we have some pretty remarkable nutrient density numbers. I'm not sure if you guys saw that study with Dr. Van Vliet, but 4x the phytonutrients, 8x the omega 3s, like pretty absurd, like from a nutritional standpoint, significantly more than beef. And it is one of those very like easy to understand win-win situations. So almost all of our growth thus far has been organic. We've spent very little money on what you typically think of as a CPG company going out and trying to buy customers. We don't play Facebook. We don't do that. Like we've had some really key influencers like Tim Ferriss and Andrew Huberman that love the brand, eat it every day, have converted to like essentially just eating these proteins. So they're like amazing advocates. But it's really come down to, I think we have a very genuine story. I think it comes across in the way we write. I don't do our writing. My wife does, co-founder. She's amazing. I think it really comes across. And I think fans are getting even more fanatical. And I think our story is one that people like to share. And that's equated to a lot of growth. And then I think we're really lucky you guys have had a chance to taste the product. Like, it tastes good. So we have, I think, exceptional product fit. And when you have exceptional product fit and fanatical people, as a CPG brand, you grow pretty quickly.
Jake, maybe talk to us about the consumer side. Introducing venison is not a common staple in a lot of American diets unless you're in the hunting community where it is more popular. How are you approaching that in terms of introducing people to this new meat supply?
Yeah, lots of resources online, lots of promises that like just try it once. I think everybody has this no money back guarantee thing, but like we absolutely mean it. If you taste it and you don't like it, we give money back on a weekly basis. And because some people in the end don't like the taste, but the vast majority of people do. And there's a really interesting reason actually. The science behind stress-free harvesting, which is in that study, and you can look at oxidative stress. Stress-free harvesting actually has the most profound impact on taste. So when you guys ate it, that really mild taste you're tasting is because they didn't convert glycogen stores to additional lactic acid and or cortisol. Like, you're actually tasting stress-free harvesting. So if we just convince somebody to taste it once, typically they're in. And then the other really interesting consumer segment, which I'm sure is a hot topic, but we get about a vegan a week that emails us and says, I never thought I'd eat meat again. The reasons you're doing it and why is something I can believe in. And then they come back and then they don't care what it tastes like. They are coming back to eat meat for a reason because they believe something. So those are usually the two ways that like people will get over that hurdle of trying venison.
I think there's like a spectrum of meat harvesting, right? Or like meat production of on the one end, we have factory farming and those animals. I think everyone, Tim and I, and most people we talk to on the podcast, pretty much everyone in the community is against like the industrial scale factory farming and like the amount of stress that is put on those animals. Like, there's a consequence on the back end. And then we go towards more grass fed, regeneratively farmed, pasture raised production, and much, much less stress on the animal, a lot more emphasis and focus on a good life and a humane death for that animal. And then just to see you almost take that a whole nother step further is just really cool and I think really compelling. And yeah, my daughters love the meat sticks. They had their first of yours and then they loved it. And so that's my wife and I keep going back to that because, get them some of that good protein. But where I wanted to end this section, Jake, is we didn't hit on it a ton. You talked about like that mobile processing facility. When it comes to CPG, you're harvesting the animal. Talk to us about the different product lines you have and how that end packaging step goes and how you have built that out and hit these different category segments.
Yeah, so mobile slaughter facilities come with us from site to within a given like radius of where we think we're going to find enough deer. Every night, those carcasses are essentially hung for about 18 hours and then transported and chilled back to a brand new facility that we built about a year and a half ago. Previous to that, it was actually, we would ship them all the way to the continent to get them processed, which was just crazy. So we finally saved up enough pennies to build our own facility. So now we can process up to 100 deer a day, down 1 pound pack of a steak strip or a loin chop or all of these different things, which is amazing. And really lets you do like quality work for the customer and have that type of consistency. And then we always look at whole carcass utilization. So what you guys see in the pet treats or the bone broth or actually the sticks go a really long way in utilizing like a cut that's not big enough to be a stew chunk, like what you understand is trim. So looking at fully utilizing that animal. And it's just something we're sticklers for. I think when you go to the effort we go to get that animal, like you're designing plans and you're working all night, you're carrying that animal on your back, like you're like working with it down to the very last hair. Like you really want like from trotter bone to like everything hides, like everything gets used. And I think our customers find a lot of value in that as well.
That's amazing. Jake, we're going to switch gears here a little bit and just zoom out and talk food and ag in general. I'd like to start with a fun one. What's your food or ag hot take?
So probably not super popular. I actually think, contrary to ag as a function of CPG, it's never been easier to find and keep customers. And I know everybody is veering away from that, saying iOS and privacy, like it's getting harder and harder to essentially just buy customers. But I think what I mentioned before, and like fans are only getting more fanatical. And those like the classic Kevin Kelly, like 1,000 true fans, they're only more fanatical at this point. And if you find them and you don't lie to them and you're genuine and you like really are in it like for the right reasons, I think they can feel that and they will go tell your story. And in doing so, like seeing that organic growth, like you don't have to compete with the million other people on Facebook trying to buy a customer for $200. Like you do it in a manner where people are proud to share what you're doing. And I think the only way to do that is to be truly genuine. So opposite of the industry, I think is actually easier than ever.
No, I think what you said is so insightful and so true that I think similar to crazy tech valuations that kind of ballooned up, I think there was also just this like competitiveness within CPG to just buy traffic, buy conversions. And yes, you can grow fast that way, but do you really have true organic, natural
Yeah.
growth that's going to be sustainable? And so I think I totally agree with you. And even now, given where the markets are at, it's even more important, right? Because your marketing dollars are more limited and everything is more crucial to focus on organic growth. So that's awesome. What emerging companies or categories are you following closely?
Oh boy, we're gonna have to be careful with this one. So I'll give the obvious like chat GPT answer, which I'm sure everybody is. How does that relate to customer service and inventory controls? And like it is just an endless, it's hard to even comprehend what it may do. So I think that's always going to be something everybody's tracking at this point. But the other one, which we mentioned prior to jumping on here, is Rivian and electric vehicles have a very unique place within our operations because they're able to A, be quiet, which is super important, and B, they have substantially more payload. They can carry a lot more. And we are extremely tough on vehicles. We, in a given night, will go from 0 to 8,000 feet and back at least once. We'll carry upwards of 4 to 5,000 pounds, depending. And one of the standards we need to meet for the USDA is basically have an animal back in the chill, no hair on it, in 45 minutes. So if we're a mile away from our mobile slaughter facility and that thing has to be back in 45 minutes on like rough off road, there is no option but to go really fast. So the actually first week we hire somebody, we give them like a rally car course at night that says you need to do this thing in under 2.5 minutes. And they're just like, what? Like the first time they attempt it, it's 10 minutes. So following electric cars really closely to understand like how gearing is going to be affected by additional weight, what payload looks like. We're really excited to basically electrify our entire fleet just for performance reasons.
Jake, what's a big prediction you have in food and agriculture over the next 5 to 10 years?
God, I would love your guys' opinion on this one. How is nutrient density on a label not going to be the denominator for everything? Like I hear so much confusion around the discussion of regenerative ag. And when we finally got that testing back, which is essentially a nutrient density test, and we saw where our numbers were, the first thing we thought of wasn't, oh, great, like we're standing apart from the market. First thing we thought of is this is nutrition of place. This is because these are the richest volcanic soils that already make the most amazing coffee. Like it is a measure of the health of your place. And I just wonder how nutrient density labeling doesn't become the denominator for regenerative ag as a whole. Because if you're taking extraordinary care of your place, which is what regenerative ag is, like stacked conservation practices, if you're taking extraordinary care of that place, like the proof will be in the nutrient density of that food. So I'm really hopeful to see what that looks like moving forward.
Yeah, I think Tim and I are both are pretty bullish on that, as well as really just like an outcomes based approach, right? Where consumers can understand, hey, like this is quantitatively more nutritious and I will pay more for that. And I think the other benefit of nutrient density is it is context specific, right? So it's not necessarily about like everyone doing the same practices across the board. It's focusing on what is doing right by their land and their context, and if and the outcome of that being higher nutrient density. No, I definitely agree with you. What's something you've changed your mind about in the last few years?
For us, it's been pricing. We were always super nervous about how we price things. And a mentor of mine told me, price everything where you're embarrassed to tell your family. And that's typically where it's going to be like a profitable business. And we obviously need things to be profitable and be sustainable. I've really changed my mindset on how aggressive we can go about our pricing if we're properly conveying that value to our customer.
Well, Jake, this has been a ton of fun as we wrap things up here. What's saving your life right now?
Exercise for sure. And my amazing wife and co-founder for sure. She's a rock star.
Jake, thank you for coming on the podcast. Love what you're up to and for really sharing more about your story and what you're doing at Maui Nui. As we wrap up, how can listeners get in touch and connect with you and Maui Nui?
Maui Nui Venison.com. Everything, the vast majority of all of our storytelling and everything is through there. And you can just pop over to the contact us and send us an email. We'll gladly respond for sure. And just as a recap, like I really appreciate what you guys do as well. You guys have complicated conversations on a weekly basis that are amazing for ag communities as a whole. So it's badass, man.
Appreciate that. Thanks for being on, Jake.
Thank you.